This week on London Real, we have the biomedical gerontologist, Dr. Aubrey de Grey.
Aging is the world's most important problem. Answer is periodic preventative maintenance. We have a 50-50 chance of getting these technologies to a decisive level of comprehensiveness within the next 20 to 25 years. There's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years. We've got to get people more comfortable with submitting to medical treatments when they're not yet sick.
London Real presents Aubrey de Grey, How to Live Forever.
I prefer to be a heretic than a maverick. At least it makes it sound as though you might be right.
And London Real is back in your life. This week on the show, we have a fascinating man by the name of Dr. Aubrey de Grey, and he is a biomedical gerontologist. What is that, Brian? That's a fantastic question. That is a guy who studies the whole concept of aging. And in Aubrey's opinion, aging is really the accumulation of damage to the human body, and it's not something that we should accept as a given or accept as something that's inevitable, and it's something that we can really find a way to prevent. And once you start thinking about aging this way, it really starts changing the whole game. And Aubrey is famous for this concept and talking about it around the world. He's also famous for that beard that he sports, which is really truly magnificent and amazing. He's also got some funding in the past for some very high-profile individuals, including Peter Thiel, who wrote him a check for about $6 million a few years ago. Peter is famous for his creation of PayPal and now Palantir and many other startup companies and investment in Facebook. And so, you know, some real big names that have supported Aubrey over the years in the research that he's doing. And so we sat down and talked about this whole concept as far as aging, you know, being this kind of this damage issue, and how ultimately we really could prevent it and start talking about us living for hundreds and hundreds of years or living forever. And it's something that really fascinates us humans, especially as you get older. You start thinking about, you know, the whole concept of you dying and if this can be prevented. And so it's something that Aubrey wants to take from kind of a research level and take it to a more practical level. And so it's a very interesting discussion. He's a fascinating guy. Reminds me of the consummate British professor and intellectual. He also spends a lot of time out in California, and you would have definitely heard of him before. So I hope you enjoy my talk with Aubrey. Like I said, a really fascinating individual with a great accent and a great thought process on life. I hope it makes you think a bit more about the concept we have of aging and whether we should maybe change our whole mind frame and start thinking of it as not something that we almost go through and then we almost get used to it, but maybe it's a medical problem that we can actually treat. So hopefully that's food for thought, and you know, that gets you excited. I'm cruising through here the mean streets of Shoreditch. You've probably seen this if you've been through East London. I want to give a big shout out to the guys that make us look good online, and those are the folks at Squarespace. This is an all-in-one platform to help you build the best-looking website or online portfolio. We use them, and it really makes us look great. And I always tell people, you know, the web is your first chance to make an impression on people, and so make it look good. I always check people's website to see if they're professional and if they look good. And with Squarespace, you can build something so simple, a blog, a video site, even an audio piece like a podcast. It's just easy. So go to squarespace.com, check it out. You can start without a credit card. Use the code London when you go to buy, and you get 10% off. And it's all good. We got lots of love for those guys there. And on our blog, which is on our Squarespace site, we've just released a new article from Dave Asprey himself, the Bulletproof exec, and this talks about the benefits of intermittent fasting, and it's something he goes more into on his fantastic book, which is The Bulletproof Diet. And to find out more about that, read the article. You can also go to orderbulletproofdietbook.com, where you can get 10% off, I think, your first purchase, and also get the book for chefs, the Bulletproof Chef ebook. So great stuff happening there. More blogs to come from Dave. The last one I think was 5 reasons how bulletproof coffee can replace your breakfast. And you know, we drink it every day here at London Real, and I serve it to all my guests. So it's all good having those guys on board. And there you go. I'm going to be signing off here and letting you spend some more time with Aubrey. If you want to support your London Real colors, go to our gear section on our website. We got hoodies, we got coffee cups, shirts, all that good stuff. Thanks for giving me love. If you haven't checked out my TED Talk, please go check it out. Leave it a comment. I'm replying to all of your questions there. So if you have a question for me, put it on the TED Talk YouTube comments, and I will get back to you. And that's it. Thanks for all the love. And now I leave you with Dr. Aubrey de Grey. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Aubrey de Grey, who is a biomedical gerontologist and the Chief Science Officer of SENS Research Foundation, dedicated to combating the aging process. He is the Editor-in-Chief of Rejuvenation Research and holds a BA and PhD from the University of Cambridge. Aubrey, welcome to London Real.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for being here. I kind of want to jump in. One quote of yours comes to mind, and it is, quote, "I am working on the world's most important problem." And I believe you want to raise awareness of the feasibility and importance of bringing aging under real medical control. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. It has intrigued me and indeed frustrated and astonished me for many years that this is something that needs to be explained to people. It seems to me to be completely obvious, and indeed it's been obvious to me ever since I was a young kid, that aging is the world's most important problem, in this very obvious sense that it causes the most suffering. 90% probably of the medical problems in the entire world, certainly in the industrialized world, and it's going up really fast, it's way over 50% in the developing world, are caused by simply having been born a long time ago, the accumulation of damage in the body as a side effect of being alive. And undoubtedly, the overwhelming majority of suffering in the world is caused by ill health. So it's a no-brainer. And yet, people don't think that way. Why not? I would say the only reason, the overwhelming reason why people don't think that way is because it's too scary. It's too miserable to be thinking that way. And the reason it's miserable is also pretty clear, namely that until quite recently, really until I came along, we haven't had the faintest idea what we could ever do about it. If there's some ghastly thing that's going to happen to you and your loved ones in the probably relatively distant future, then you're not going to want to spend your miserably short life being preoccupied by this terrible thing. What you're going to want to do is find some way to put it out of your mind and, you know, get on with it and make the best of what you've got. And it doesn't matter how you put it out of your mind, how irrational your rationalization is. And so I come across the most utterly laughable, tragic arguments that people give for saying aging is actually a good thing or it doesn't matter or whatever. But ultimately, I don't exactly ridicule these people at all. I really sympathize with that kind of thinking. It's just that now it's out of date. It's only become out of date in the past 10 or 15 years since we've got a plan for actually bringing aging under medical control, and that plan has a respectable chance of delivering within the foreseeable future in time for lots and lots of people who are already alive today. But now that is the case, this irrationality is a huge part of the problem. It's undoubtedly slowing things down a lot and costing us a lot of lives.
Right, and as humans, it's fascinating because I was watching your TED Talk and you say it's the most important problem in the world, and I'm like, yes, it is, because I'm watching you and you quote the figures like 100,000 people die every day, you know, from age-related issues, and that's twice as big as the next biggest killer. Mm-hmm. And in the developed world, it's 90% of the cause of death. And so you're like, but as humans, I know that we just naturally avoid certain things that we don't like, and subconsciously we make these decisions. And aging and dying from old age is something that is it's one of our greatest fears, isn't it?
One thing I want to actually emphasize really at the outset here is that the death aspect is really not the main thing I want to emphasize in terms of the suffering. Because, yeah, death is bad. People, you know, mourn about people who've died. But the fact is, in general, aging causes people to go downhill for a long time. So when you're in a really bad state of health, a lot of people will say, well, death isn't such a bad thing. But of course, that's not the point. The point here is to stop people from going downhill in the first place. So the longevity benefits that we may experience, that we may benefit from as a result of these therapies that I and my colleagues are trying to deliver, are a side effect. They are a side benefit of the health benefits. Since being sick is the main risk factor for dying, it stands to reason that if you can stop people from getting sick, then they're going to live longer on average. And if you can't stop people from getting sick, then they're not going to live longer on average. So nobody has any right to worry about the possibility that we will substantially extend people's ill health, that we will keep people alive for a long time in the state of health that is typical of today's elderly. What we will do is we will have people living longer, but that will be because they're staying healthy longer.
Right. And you talk about it more as physics and less of biology. You were saying that as soon as we're born, we start deteriorating, and you said aging is the accumulation of damage, which is an interesting way of thinking about it, because as humans, we don't see a 10-year-old and a 15 and 20-year-old as having damage, but obviously we see 60, 70, and 80-year-old, depending on the amount of damage that we connotate with aging. Is that really a frame of reference and the way we're thinking of it?
It really is. A lot of people have difficulty with this analogy when I say, listen, the human body is simply a machine, it accumulates damage just like a car or an airplane. But in fact, it's a really good analogy. The difference between the human body or any living organism on the one hand and inanimate objects like cars or airplanes on the other hand is very substantial, but it's only a difference of degree. What we have is, number one, that living organisms are much more complicated and that we don't understand them very well because, of course, we didn't design them. And secondly, number two, that living organisms do have built into them a lot of automatic self-repair machinery that gets rid of most of the damage they do to themselves as it's being created.
Right. So we see these machines that are repairing themselves all the time, and then we don't equate them with real machines.
Right. But these differences are not decisive. The similarities are the decisive thing, because, number one, the complexity is just a matter of degree, obviously. And number two, the fact that we have lots of inbuilt automatic self-repair machinery doesn't take away from the fact that there's some types of damage that the body does to itself for which we do not have repair machinery. And those types of damage accumulate throughout life, just like the various types of damage that a car does to itself as a result of, rust accumulating, being taken out on the road or whatever. So really the analogy is very, very valid. There are other parts of the analogy that are valid. One part is what you mentioned a moment ago about it's not being clear that a 10-year-old or even a 20-year-old has any damage. That's very true. But it's also not apparent that a 1-year-old car has any damage. The thing is that just like simple man-made machines, living organisms are set up to tolerate a certain amount of damage with essentially negligible diminution of function. And it's only after the damage accumulates to a level that exceeds that threshold that we see the function diminishing and going downhill. Okay. And of course, eventually the function ceases entirely, just like a car. Right. So that analogy is really the main thing that led me to the thinking that led to the SENSE research program. I realized that in order to really postpone the ill health of old age in the human body, we needed to look at what we already do that successfully postpones ill health in cars or airplanes. Because the fact is, we're damn good at that. Cars are not built to last more than 10 or 15 years. Maybe some cars, like Land Rovers, might be built to last 50 years. But your typical car isn't. And yet, we've got cars around today that are more than 100 years old. What's going on there? How did that happen? Answer is periodic preventative maintenance. Now, all of us have cars that we do a certain amount of maintenance on, the amount that the law requires, and the cars are set up to last a certain amount of time in the context of that amount of maintenance. But the reason we have vintage cars is because if you do more comprehensive maintenance than the law requires, lo and behold, it works better. and we actually maintain performance just as well as when the car was originally built. So that's the goal for the human body. Of course, then there are subsequent steps, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about going forward, with regard to what this actually comes down to in concrete terms, but that's the philosophy.
Okay, and then you start talking about actual regeneration. And when you do that, I'm sure you really get people shocked. Because when people start thinking about regeneration, then they start going to science fiction and they're thinking, oh, this isn't natural. Because as a human, I think we're just, that seems like the most impossible thing to reverse the process of aging.
The word that really sits at the fulcrum of my message in that regard is not exactly regeneration, but rejuvenation. So regenerative medicine is something that people are pretty familiar with these days. That's the word that encompasses things like stem cell therapy and tissue engineering. And people know that this is the future of medicine. This is coming all the time. There are news reports about breakthroughs every week, clinical trials and so on. That's all very wonderful. What we're doing is we're saying, why don't we try to apply regenerative medicine to the problems of aging, the problems of age-related ill health? And the practicality is that if you do simple traditional regenerative medicine, stem cell therapies and such like, to address the ill health of old age, you'll make some difference, but you won't really extend healthy longevity and therefore not total longevity either all that much. The reason you won't is because there are some aspects of aging which do not come into the same kind of classification of types of damage that regenerative medicine has been designed for. So what I've done is I've expanded, if you like, I've expanded the definition of regenerative medicine. I've pointed out that there are a number of other potential therapies that need to exist in order to really comprehensively address the damage of aging. And those are therapies that would not traditionally be classified as regenerative medicine, but in a sense they really should be, because they are also about damage repair, about restoring the molecular and cellular structure and composition of the body, of an organ or a tissue or the whole body, to how it was before the damage occurred in the first place.
Let me ask you some questions you get asked a lot, which are just these knee-jerk kind of reactions as humans before we dive in any deeper. And one of them that I know you've heard of before is, well, what are we going to do with all the people? If we all live, well, forever, let's take the extreme circumstances. What do you say when that comes up?
Whenever I'm asked about any of the sociological questions, which some people like to call philosophical, but I don't think they're philosophical at all, they're really sociological questions about aging, I have three answers. So these are questions that ultimately revolve around the possibility that by solving the number one problem we have today, we will create other problems. So my first answer is specific. I go into the details of what we can actually realistically expect to occur in relation to the creation of this new problem. So let's just do the overpopulation one. There's things that we have to take into account that a lot of people don't. Number one, the fact that fertility rates are going down. Women are just choosing to have fewer children. And this is happening across the world, including the developing world, like Brazil, India, not just China with the one-child policy. It's all over. Number two, women are choosing to have their children a lot later than they were. Well, when I say a lot later, maybe only 5 years later, something like that, but it's going to be a hell of a lot later in due course, because soon we're not going to have menopause. So the women are going to have the choice to have their first kid at the age of 70 or whatever. Right?
Fascinating concept, yeah.
But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for overpopulation, we have to take into account that the carrying capacity of the planet is not a fixed quantity. That's what it's all about, remember. There's not a problem having 7 billion people on the planet. The problem is that we have 7 billion people, each of whom is actually, responsible for a certain amount of pollution. If we can get better renewable energy, nuclear fusion, things like that, then we're going to be able to have more people on the planet with less environmental impact. So, again, the prospect of an overpopulation crisis is very overblown in most people's knee-jerk reactions.
Right.
Okay, so hang on. So I give this kind of answer, and of course I've got the same kind of answer to how we pay the pensions, how we make sure everyone has access, won't dictators live forever, whatever. But I want to move on to the other two answers, because these are very important, and they are the same answer. It's a generic answer that covers all of these things. The second answer is, hang on, let's look at the scale of the problem. Sure, I don't know for certain that we're not going to have an overpopulation problem. I don't know for certain that we're not going to have dictator living forever and so on. But how bad are those problems? Really, even if they did happen, are they as bad as the problem we have today of all the suffering that's caused by aging and 100,000 or more people dying every day, 30 World Trade Centers every day? Is it really conceivable that even if we had to engage in seriously draconian reduction of birth rates, that would be worse than the problem we have today? It really doesn't add up. That's the second answer. And the third answer is perhaps even more decisive. You may say, well, you know, I really want kids. I think a lot of people really want kids. I think it might be worse than the problem we have today. After all, we have succeeded in putting that problem out of our minds so well, as I've pointed out. Right? But my answer to that says, hang on, whose decision should it be? Whose choice should it be? We have the choice today of developing these therapies or not developing them. Supposing we chose to say, oh dear, overpopulation, let's not go there, then we would be denying humanity of the future the option of whether to use these therapies or not, because they wouldn't have been developed. That we would be condemning them to having the same kind of premature suffering and death that we have experienced throughout history. Whereas if we do develop the therapies, then we're saying to humanity of the future, here it is, take it or leave it. They have the choice. It seems to me to be absolutely unequivocal that we have a clear and present moral obligation to do that latter thing, to give humanity of the future that option by getting on and developing these therapies as soon as possible.
Can anyone argue against those points? I have a hard time even giving an argument against those points you just made.
Well, I have certainly never heard a cogent argument against those points, but of course, you know, a lot of people don't really care about whether their arguments are cogent. I'm often forced to quote that famous Upton Sinclair aphorism. He said that it's very hard to explain something to somebody, to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on not understanding it.
So you mentioned rejuvenation, not regeneration. How close are we to real rejuvenation, to reversing the process, or to making me at 44 this year live to be 144? How old are you, can I ask?
I'm 51.
51, okay.
Yeah.
Or for you to live to 151, or maybe I'm thinking too small here.
So first of all, let me emphasize, I'm not really saying that rejuvenation and regeneration are in any way incompatible. Rather the opposite. I'm saying that rejuvenation is the application of regeneration to aging. Okay. And it needs to be defined a bit more broadly in terms of the technologies involved than regenerative medicine is traditionally defined. But ultimately, it is simply the same thing, just applied to aging. Okay. All right, so in terms of how soon we might get there. Now, of course, this is pioneering technology. We're a long way from getting there, and any technology that's even a couple of years away, you know, it's a mug's game trying to actually speculate about how far away it really is. And so most of my colleagues will say, well, we just shouldn't be doing this speculation. We shouldn't be getting people's hopes up. I say that that's an irresponsible attitude. I say that even though we must recognize that our predictions are very speculative, they're going to be better than most people's predictions, and therefore we have a responsibility to do this, especially in the case of aging, where there is this knee-jerk tendency to make over-pessimistic predictions, to presume that it's never going to happen. So here's my prediction. I say that we have a 50-50 chance of getting these technologies to a decisive level of comprehensiveness within the next 20 to 25 years. I think that there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years, you know, if we hit new problems that we don't know about yet. And also, I have to absolutely emphasize that the only way we'll get there within 20 or 25 years is if the next 5 or 10 years lead to progress in the laboratory that really constitutes good proof of concept. And that will only happen if the funding situation for this work substantially improves.
Right.
At the moment, it's ridiculously underfunded.
Let me ask you about that. Bill Gates has put his fortune and his life work into curing these ailments around the world. I just heard an interview with him, and he's talking about, you know, malaria and all of these issues that, okay, I get it, they're important. But when I listen to you knock off these figures and these numbers, part of me says, why isn't Bill thinking about aging? And I want to talk about this interesting factor is that the older you get, does this not slightly become more important in your life?
Well, let me deal with the last part of your question first,
Okay.
because I've got something to say about that for sure. I do find it extremely frustrating that people tend to get involved in any philanthropic exercise, typically when it has touched them personally. So, Sergey Brin putting huge amounts of money into Parkinson's research only once he discovered that he carries some genetic mutation that predisposes him to getting Parkinson's a bit earlier than the average person. Right. Nancy Reagan being an Alzheimer's advocate only after Ronald Reagan. There's so many cases, right? And, that's all very well. I can understand why it concentrates the mind, but honestly, these are intelligent people, and they would, if you ask them, are you fundamentally humanitarian, they wouldn't say no, right? So it makes no sense to me, and especially it makes no sense for really pioneering things. Because if you look at the actual mathematics of it, it makes, I think that we've got a 50% chance of getting to these therapies working within 20 to 25 years. Now, I think that I myself am making a difference to that number. I certainly do. And that's great. I'm very proud of that, and it's very fulfilling. But how much difference? Even in the most extreme example, I can't really see that I'm making more than about 5 years of difference. So if I look at what that means in terms of my own probability of making the cut, it's maybe 5%. Either it's harder than I think it is, and therefore, however much work I do, I'm not going to make it. Or it's easier than I think it is, and therefore, even if I were doing something completely different, I would make it. So it's only this little grey area in the middle where I'm really affecting my own chances.
Right.
And, it's not very exciting, 5%.
No, it doesn't move the needle, as we say.
But if I think in terms of the humanitarian aspect, the argument is completely different. Because every single day that I bring forward the defeat of aging, and I reckon I'm probably doing that about once a month, I'm saving 100,000 lives. That's fairly easy to get out of bed for. And I don't understand why philanthropists in general don't think that way. It really pisses me off.
Let's take Gates, for example.
So let me actually move on.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates is an example of someone who is not does not have that problem. He's very definitely doing stuff for the disadvantaged, and he would not count as one of the disadvantaged.
Right.
So that's great in that sense. But what he's done is he's decided very explicitly that what he wants to do is to help the disadvantaged. He wants to help people at the tail of the curve. And, that's fine. I don't want in any way for Bill Gates to reduce the amount of money he spends on malaria nets and mosquito nets and malaria vaccinations and so on. That's great. However, at the end of the day, in the long run, unless you also push the leading edge of the curve, everyone suffers. So it's extremely important. It's absolutely vital that some philanthropists, not necessarily all, but some, should be going in and helping the leading edge to move forward as well. And of course, that's what I've benefited from, with Peter Thiel in particular, coming in and putting very substantial amounts of money over several years into what we do. Okay,
so Peter Thiel is a fan and an investor in what you do.
Peter's been, without Peter, I have no idea where we'd be. I mean, we have, adding it all together, I think we've received something in the region of $6.5 million from Peter since 2006. And for sure, that's been the major source of funding, with the exception of the money that I was able to put in when I inherited a chunk of money a few years ago from my mother.
That's a ringing endorsement. I mean, Peter is regarded, extremely highly in the technology community and the world community. Some recent book out, 0 to 1. I mean, that's a ringing endorsement on top of the funding, for you.
Yes, you're right. And of course, Peter was already a very well thought of kind of guy back in 2006. He was actually doing particularly well back then with his hedge fund as well, which is one of his few only temporary successes, because it went a bit south after that. So, I definitely thought in 2006, 2007 that my advocacy job was more or less done, that correspondingly wealthy people would be lining up, to follow Peter's lead. And it was extremely frustrating that that didn't happen. We had one donor come in 2010 at a comparable kind of level, and that's really all. All the other donations we get are at a much lower level. And of course, the sheer number of donors is going up, and so things are improving gradually. But to be honest, it makes no sense to me that so few philanthropists are visionary enough to be following this kind of approach.
What if Bill Gates did a 180 and listened to this and decided to cut you a check for $1 billion tomorrow? What would you do with that, and how would that move the needle, as you're saying, about this research?
I believe that at the moment, if we added a digit to the amount that we're spending each year, so we went up to $50 or $100 million a year rather than the $5 million a year we're spending at the moment, then we could probably accelerate the research by a factor of about 3. So if I got $1 billion tomorrow, spending it over a period of maybe 6 to 10 years, then that's what it would, how it would be spent. And I believe that with high probability, well, not high, but I'm going to say 70% probability, that we could, within 10 years, reach a point that I've defined as robust mouse rejuvenation, which basically says we develop all of the various strands of sense and put them all together in the same mice, such that we can take mice that have had nothing done to them at all until middle age and rejuvenate them really well enough that they live 2 years longer than they otherwise would, which is a hell of a lot more for a mouse.
Right.
That, it seems to me, is, even taking it quite conservatively, that is enough to convince the world, specialists, of course, opinion formers, the world, that we are within striking distance, that it's only a matter of time before we can do the corresponding thing for humans. At the moment, we can extend mouse lifespan by at least a year or so, but only by doing things to those mice throughout their lives, ideally even doing it genetically to their ancestors, their parents. We can't take mice. The best we can do if we take mice that are already in middle age is a few months addition to their lifespan. We need to increase that by, I'm going to say, a factor of 5 before we can really show that we've got this thing licked.
And do you think, say if you look forward 50 years from now, I know this is just speculation, but if this treatment was perfected, is this something that you see maybe as humans we would go in every 6 months or every year and have a shot, and that would kind of keep us rejuvenated and regenerated?
This will be a periodic treatment. The actual how periodic, how often the treatment happens, will depend a lot on the details that we can't tell yet. For example, at the beginning, I think it's quite likely that some of this will have to be administered surgically. We'll have to actually go in and give someone a whole new heart or a whole new liver. And you wouldn't want to do that every 6 months. Every 10 years, possibly. Ideally, though, and I think very rapidly after we get this first generation panel of therapies, we will get to a position where everything can be done much less invasively, by injections and even by oral administration. Today, we obviously have very early stage stem cell therapies and gene therapies, and those are administered by injections. And we're going to need a lot of stem cell therapies and a lot of gene therapies when we develop sense properly. There's no reason at all why those should not also be delivered by injections rather than by any kind of surgery. Things can, in principle, move on to straightforward oral administration. And of course, the less invasive a therapy is, an intervention is, the more frequently it can be administered, and therefore the more thoroughly it can have its effects.
Let's talk about money. You had a couple graphs at one of your talks at Google, and it was showing kind of the amount that we've spent on medical care, and I think maybe even the length of the life that it increased. And then you did kind of a division, and it was the percentage of GDP that we spent on healthcare, and I believe it's gone something like 5% up to 18%, which is just astounding that we spend that much of our money on healthcare. And I know a lot of that is a lot of times in the last 6 months, of the life of a human. What do those numbers tell you on the surface? Yeah,
you've got those numbers right. That's US statistics from the period, if I remember rightly, from 1960 through to about 2010. 5% of GDP going up to 18%. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Wow.
And it's going to carry on going up for the next while. The reason it's getting so high is the things that used to be easy to cure are so easy to cure that people aren't dying of them. And so people are living long enough that they're getting to suffer the things that we can't cure. Those things are the chronic, progressive diseases of old age that are increasingly expensive to, if you like, manage rather than cure. And that's what people have got these days. We just don't have ways to cure them.
What are some of those, just so people have a reference?
So we're talking about Alzheimer's disease. We're talking about heart disease, or most cancers, or type 2 diabetes, or osteoporosis. All of the things that young adults basically never get, but that become exponentially more frequent, more prevalent in old age.
Right. And those are the ones, those are kind of fascinating, because we think of those as old age diseases or diseases, but we shouldn't be thinking of them that way, right? We should be thinking of those as accumulation.
The real problem is the definition of the word disease. When we use the word disease, we put into people's mind the concept of cure, the concept of medicine that can eliminate the disease from the body. Because that's what it is when we talk about diseases that are exogenous, that come from infectious agents.
Right, smallpox, for example.
For example.
Okay.
But when a disease is a disease of old age, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why it doesn't affect people in early adulthood. The reason is simply that it's a consequence of the lifelong accumulation of progressive change in the molecular and cellular structure and composition of the body. Those changes are what I call damage. Those changes are called damage simply because eventually they're bad for you. They cause diminution of function. For a long time, they don't cause detectable diminution of function simply because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage, of those changes. But eventually, when there's too much change, the function goes down. That's what we call disease. We call it disease simply because it's bad for you. It causes you not to work very well. But in terms of its medical significance, using the word disease, using the same word we use for infections, is actually very misleading and causes the mistakes that we're making in terms of medical research and medical care today.
Yeah, how important is language? You mentioned that word disease. It gets thrown around when it comes to alcoholism and a lot of other things that gets thrown around. I mean, how important is language? Because on this show, we've talked about medicine versus drugs. I mean, that's a distinct language issue that polarizes people constantly, and whether they call it this or that, they can make completely different decisions about life. I'm sure you come upon this all the time.
I think it's enormously important to use language carefully. People very, very often do not appreciate how easily they can be misunderstood when they use terminology that they think they understand. They think they know that everyone defines a word the same way. The word disease is a case in point. The word aging itself, of course, is an even bigger case in point. When I hear people, my critics especially, explain what's wrong with what I'm saying, then 90% of the time, I will understand that where they're going wrong is they're using the word aging in an inherently contradictory way. And I have a very straightforward trick. I have a very straightforward bullshit detector. All I do is I ask them if they could please be so kind as to repeat what they just said without using the word aging. That's all I need to do. And they immediately reveal themselves as talking complete bullshit.
What's an example of that?
Aging is not a disease. What the hell is that supposed to mean? What's it supposed to mean? Does it mean aging is inherently not amenable to medical intervention? Does it mean that aging is natural and therefore we shouldn't be trying to fix it? Neither of these things make any sense at all when you put it in terms of ill health. If you say the ill health of old age is not a disease, then you're trying to say the ill health of old age doesn't matter, and that sounds fairly ageist, really. Right. People wouldn't subscribe to that, but they do subscribe to it by default when they use the word aging in such sentences.
I just something came to mind where if you grew up your entire life and were told, that the sun revolves around the earth and then the world was flat, and then you have all these thoughts, and then when someone tries to tell you different, you're like, that's insane. And it's almost like we grow up and we see grandpa and grandma and then they disappear, and we are just told that, not even told overtly, but we're conditioned to the fact that aging is something we have to accept, it's something we can't change, and it's just part of life, right?
You're absolutely right. And actually, if I look at most of the people who are in my field, and the people who really are my colleagues as crusaders against aging, Most of them, if you ask them how they got that way, they will tell a story of some kind of epiphany. They will say that there was this particular moment in their lives when suddenly they began to realize that what they had been told, what they had always thought about aging, didn't quite add up, and they started to think it through, and they realized, hang on, this makes no sense. And they realized that aging was actually a perfectly straightforward medical problem that needs to be fixed and could be fixed. Now, a few of us, including myself, didn't have that. I actually never had this misconception. I can't reconstruct how I got that way, but the fact is, ever since I was a very young kid, for sure, I always understood, it was completely obvious, that aging was, number one, a medical problem, number two, it was bad for you and it was a bad thing, and number three, it was potentially amenable to medical intervention, even though it was clearly a very difficult problem. So the epiphany that I had was a different type of epiphany. When I was in my late 20s, and I married first and then met a few other biologists, I started to realize that actually they were all mad. They, not just they, but of course people in general, just didn't think about aging in the way that was obviously true. It was like they all thought the sky was purple. You know, they just had this bizarre misconception. It took me a couple of years, really, to get my head around it, to come to terms with it. But eventually, when I did, it was a no-brainer that I needed to switch fields. I was already working on what I believed was the second most important humanitarian problem in the world, namely the fact that we have to spend so much of our time doing tedious stuff, like going down mines and, serving hamburgers and so on, because we don't have machines to do these things for us. And of course, the increase in automation, in relieving us of these things, has been going on for more than 100 years, ever since the Industrial Revolution got going, or arguably earlier than that. And it's still going. And I was working in that cause. I was working on artificial intelligence research. But it was always completely clear to me that that was only the second most important problem of humanity, and the first most important problem was the fact that we get sick and die when we get old. So when I found out that, contrary to my prior belief, biologists in general thought that aging was actually rather uninteresting and rather unimportant, I immediately felt, well, I've got to switch fields. And luckily, I was in a position where I was able to do that very quickly.
Right. And so your prime objective is to really put awareness on this and say, we need to really put even a small percentage of our efforts towards recognizing this is an issue. It's something that we don't have to accept, and we need to really pay attention to this. I mean, I
guess I would say that my prime objective is simply the result. I want these therapies to be developed as soon as possible. So in a sense, awareness is a means to an end. If I had $1 billion already, I had all the money I needed to get all the research done that I felt was critical path, then I'd probably do not nearly so many interviews and not nearly so many talks, because I'd be focusing on spending that money as optimally as possible. But the fact is, today, that money is not forthcoming, which means that the two things are very linked. The awareness, the outreach, the raising of people's understanding of the quality of debate on all of this is a route to bringing money in the door and getting the work done.
Are we, in a sense, doing our own rejuvenation? If you look at the lifespans or the behaviors of humans in the last 50, 100 years, I mean, the fact that we're eating differently to prevent diabetes, and we're, doing this for heart disease, and doing this to try to keep our bodies from aging at the same rate, is that?
We are certainly getting better at looking after our bodies. And it's generally agreed that that's the main reason why life expectancy, why people's average age at death has gone up over the past 50 or 60 or 70 years. In the century or so prior to World War II, we mainly benefited in terms of average lifespan from a completely different phenomenon, namely the control of infectious disease, which in the Victorian era used to take out more than 1/3 of all babies before they even reach the age of 1, and of course a lot of mothers in childbirth and so on.
Right.
That was pretty much a historical problem by World War II. It was pretty much over. So we were not going to be able to gain any additional increase in longevity by bearing down even better on that. But what we have achieved is bearing down on the mortality rates, the risk of death in older ages. And most of that improvement has not been just because we've got more and more sophisticated medicine, but rather lifelong effects, what are often called cohort effects. things like people's parents being a bit more prosperous and being able to give their kids better prenatal and early life nutrition. Also, of course, smoking becoming less prevalent. Obesity becoming a bit less prevalent until recently, of course. Things like that.
Right.
So, whether that will continue is a bit of a debate right now. I'm somewhat on the pessimistic side of that equation, of that debate. I think that it's likely that the rate of increase in longevity that we've seen since World War II is likely to level off over the next 10 or 20 years, and it will only resume again in a much more rapid way, in my view, once regenerative medicine for aging, rejuvenation technology of the sort that Sense Research Foundation is working on, actually hits the streets.
When you talk about these diseases like Alzheimer's and some of these other pieces, it's scary. I mean, and I must say that I'm guessing the older the person is that you talk to, the more maybe that seems more of a possibility. And now when I see 90, 95-year-old grandma and kind of what's happening, part of me really sees those as very scary, dangerous years of my life that I don't want to experience. When you tell me there's a lot of pain around those years, I believe you and I see it. But when I was 25, I don't know if I would have listened to you. Is that strange? Do you feel different vibes from different audience based strictly on age group that you speak to?
I do feel different vibes from different audiences based on many things, including age group. I personally have a bit of trouble relating to that. I mean, I've had a very lucky life in terms of the ill health of my elderly loved ones. First of all, I haven't had very many elderly loved ones, and second of all, the ones that they have had have, by today's standards, faded away pretty with a minimal amount of suffering. But I can certainly see that it's understandable and certainly very common that people who do experience suffering of their parents or grandparents have their minds somewhat more concentrated.
Right. And do you think, so for you, it's kind of a scientific issue. You said this should be obvious. We should be taking the vote. It shouldn't be that you have to be 60 before you start realizing this is important.
Exactly.
That's because you're a scientific person.
Well, I mean, really, it's just because I'm a logical person. Right. I mean, how can one really put this out of one's mind? It's just crazy.
Right. Right. When it comes to the actual practicality, I know you said that the whole concept of metabolism and how it works is still very hard for us to understand. But for you, that you've kind of charted out that there are these 7 types of damage that happens to our cells. And so I guess for you, it's like you don't need to specifically say this is what's going to fix it. You've pretty much come to the point of this is the system and this needs to be addressed.
That's kind of right. Essentially, I started out from an appreciation that our metabolism, the network of processes that keep us alive from one day to the next, is ridiculously complicated, far, far more complicated than any man-made machine, even a nuclear power station or whatever, and that we have a very, very poor understanding of it because we're reverse engineering it. We're unpicking it from the ground up when it exists rather than having blueprints. So the only practical way, I realized very early on that the only practical way to go about really intervening in this in a manner that works without having unacceptable side effects that we didn't intend is to find some way of sidestepping all that ignorance, find some way of manipulating the system that does not interfere with it. And I realized that the best way to do that was not to try to slow down the rate at which the body does damage to itself, because that would inherently require us to retool the way the body works in the first place, and we just don't know enough. I realized we had to intervene later in the chain of events than that. However, I also realized, and this is by no means my original observation, this is something that many people had realized, that you could also intervene too late. That if you tried simply to bash away at the symptoms of aging, the diseases and disabilities, the loss of performance at the mental and physical level, you're also going to fail. Number one, because those things are also very complicated. We understand them, we can see them, but the thing is they interact, they exacerbate each other. It's really tough. But number two, perhaps even more fundamentally, these issues are aspects of the later stages of aging, which means that the things that cause them, the accumulation of damage that's happening even starting before we're born, is continuing to occur, simply because we are continuing to operate in the same way. And therefore, any geriatric medicine, any medicine that's attacking the symptoms of aging, is inherently going to become progressively less effective, less powerful as the patient gets older. So I realized we needed to dive in at some point between those two. And the big breakthrough in 2000 was when I saw how we could do that. I saw that the goal of repairing damage, repairing these intermediates that exist between, if you like, being alive and being dead, was actually a practical option, simply because the many types of damage that the body does to itself could be classified into a very manageable number of categories, just these 7 categories that I talk about all the time these days. And that classification was useful because within each category, for each category, there is a generic approach to therapy, a generic type of intervention that can repair the damage. It may differ in detail from one tissue that has that type of damage to another, but only in detail.
What do the religious fundamentals say about you? Do they come after you? Do they have certain ideas or thoughts, or do they think we shouldn't even be thinking about these ideas?
Great question. I've actually been a little bit surprised at the situation in that regard. I was kind of expecting that I would get more energetic opposition from people coming from a religious perspective. And I really only have 2 explanations for why that hasn't really happened. The first explanation is maybe I'm just not on their radar yet. You know, I've got this problem, as I mentioned, that people just put aging out of their minds. Maybe people who are very religious are even better than average at putting this out of their minds, so much so that they haven't really even noticed me. But of course, as time goes on, that becomes less and less plausible as an explanation. So the other explanation is that they see that actually they don't have a leg to stand on. One of the really good things about someone who talks about this or talks about anything from a religious perspective is they're not so slippery as secular argumenters often are, because they've got actual written texts to start from. If something is written down in the Holy Scripture that they regard as gospel, whether it's actually the Holy Gospel in the Christian Church or whether it's the Quran or whatever, then you've got something you can look at and say, well, okay, look, this says this, and so on. And that's what I do. When I'm asked by a Christian, for example, about the question of whether this is a good idea, I don't just try to argue that this is compatible with Holy Scripture. I argue very strongly that it's mandated by Scripture, that it would be a sin not to be doing this work. And it's very easy to make that argument. All I have to say is, listen, aging causes suffering. It causes by far the most suffering in the world. Scripture is fairly unequivocal that our duty down here, before we get taken up to heaven, is to minimize people's suffering. So, you know, QED. And if we talk about the death rather than the suffering, same deal, you know. Suicide is supposed to be a sin, and murder is supposed to be a sin. Now, we also know that there's no moral distinction between action and inaction. If we look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, it was the person who didn't take action who was the sinner, right? So that means that suicide by inaction, in other words, you know, not doing one's best to benefit from medicine, is a sin. And, of course, that extends very straightforwardly to not doing one's best to hasten the development of medicines that don't yet exist, but might exist in time to, you know. So it's a pretty straightforward argument, really. Yeah, it's pretty elementary.
How are you received in America versus the UK? Who do you find listens more, or do you get different reactions?
I get a bit more of a positive response in the US than in the UK, but I don't want to say it's a big difference. There's a huge spectrum in both countries, and in every other country for that matter. There are lots and lots of people who are visionary and positive and understand how to think logically and who get this pretty easily, and there are also lots and lots of people who will die before they get it.
And any other things sticking out, Russians or Latin Americans or any other groups that kind of come in and shine more or less than others when it comes to this message?
There are a few groups that are overrepresented among this community. Canadians turn out to be, I don't know why, but there's an awful lot of Canadians who are not just, you know, out there being verbally vocal and supportive, but actually they are heavily involved. Very disproportionate. Libertarians, certainly. Of course, the biggest thing is people from the IT world and hard sciences, math, physics. I think that kind of makes sense because I think that the kind of training one gets in those areas is training that makes one much more comfortable with big extrapolation, with thinking way outside of the box, thinking about how if something makes sense in a small way today, then it makes sense in a big way in the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is, like you said, you're very logical. So it's not necessarily that you're a scientific background. This makes logical sense. But unfortunately, we've been conditioned our whole lives with these assumptions about aging that I think maybe you have a little bit more luck with people that run the numbers. Because when you run the numbers, this is really obvious. But if I hadn't have heard you talk about it, I wouldn't have thought about it myself. So I guess that's what makes your job so hard.
It makes it hard. However, the good news is that I do an awful lot of media, and I give an awful lot of talks. Probably I give 50 talks a year, probably 100 interviews a year. And, this is quite remarkable if you think about it, because we don't actually have very much progress to report. I mean, of course, we do make progress, but lots of it's very, very technical, not very newsworthy. And yet the media appetite for what I'm saying seems to be insatiable. That's very handy. It means that I can engage in a lot of repeat advertising. And I seem to need to do that. I mean, I've been giving high-profile interviews on national television across the world for more than a decade now.
Right.
And yet, there are still huge numbers of people who somehow or other haven't heard this.
Yeah, I think it's maybe they don't want to hear it, or maybe part of their subconscious is blocking it out.
I think
because
you're right.
it cuts down to our mortality, which is something that's, you could argue, is the prime thing on our mind, at all times. But we were talking earlier, you were on the Colbert Report back when your book came out, I think in '08, and these are big places, and yet part of us maybe isn't listening. For the people that are watching right now, what is the one thing they can do? Is it promote awareness of your message? Is it to talk about what you're doing? What is the thing they can do?
So, of course, the critical thing when people ask me what they can do is everyone's got different opportunities. Of course, if you're a wealthy individual, you can support the research directly. If you're an opinion former in any way, whether you're a journalist like yourself, for example, you can promote it by getting me on camera or on stage. If you're a biologist, you can choose which fields of biology to work in so as to be able to give yourself the best chance of making an important contribution. If you're not a biologist but you're a scientist, you can get into biology. One thing that absolutely everybody could do, though, and you're absolutely right to highlight it, is advocacy, one way or another. It doesn't matter who your audience is, whether it's your friends, your family, your colleagues. The more people get it, the more people can talk about it and get other people to get it. And as this wave grows, as this movement grows, it becomes more and more legitimate, if you like, more and more credible, more and more acceptable. Certainly, I can say that 10 years ago, my experience in general audiences, in conversation, was much more painful than it is today. Today, you can talk about these things and it's an acceptable topic of conversation. And of course, as one of the leaders in this field, I'm able to give information and have it be well received quickly. Whereas 10 years ago, people would hear what I say and they wouldn't be able to actually see that I was saying anything wrong, but they would still walk the other way.
Right. And just want to highlight that. I think your information comes across very well graphically, and definitely watch Dr. de Grey's TED Talk and his Google Talk. You talk about gerontology versus geriatrics, and it really breaks down a lot of these ideas, which, they make them very crystal clear, with your graphics. You talk about advocacy, because ultimately you need the governments to write checks to make the big needle move.
So
right?
This is actually something I want to emphasize, the actual numbers involved. The work that mostly needs to be done at the moment, in the next, let's say, 5 or 8 years, is actually not clinical work. It's work in the laboratory, in cells and in mice. And work like that is vastly less expensive than clinical trials and such like, which means that even as little as $50 million, $100 million a year would probably cover all of the really big low-hanging fruit, the big critical path stuff that needs to be done. Now, after we actually get real good proof of concept in maybe 6 or 8 or 10 years from now, Then, as things do move to clinical trials, the amount of money involved is going to be very much larger. But by then, I'm kind of not worried, because everyone's going to get it. That's when the real pandemonium is going to occur, when everybody realizes that it's only a matter of time, because we've already done it in the lab. And so, arguably, governments are not really necessarily the priority. It would be nice to get governments on board, but hey, you know, public policy is always following public opinion rather than leading it, because elected officials want to get re-elected. So, you know, it's not necessarily the right way to be going. And that's really why we set up Sense Research Foundation as a non-profit, as a charity, a 501c3, because we know that, in principle, this can easily be funded to an adequate degree just by individuals, whether high net worth or not.
What about the drug companies? Why aren't they jumping in on this or getting involved?
That's a rather easier question, and it's, you know, it's going to happen, no question. But the fact is, the drug companies are companies. The whole medical industry is driven by the same motivation that any industry is driven by, the profit motive, and they have to see that they are going to make the profits. Now, that doesn't necessarily just equate to this is the coming thing. In other words, a lot of people in this space are going to make profits. They have to figure out how they are going to beat their competitors. So a lot of this is a wait-and-see business. They know that this is still very early-stage pioneering stuff. They don't know whose intellectual property is going to win the race. And so, yes, Sense Research Foundation, we think we're in the lead in a bunch of important areas, and we do have a policy of patenting stuff to some extent, but we're not driven by that. We're driven by wanting the result. So in due course, yes, we already actually, in the early stages, of spinning some of our technology out, but our most important goal is simply to get the technology to be developed. And as far as we're concerned, Big Pharma, the rest of the medical industry, can come in when they think it makes sense for them to come in.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You know, the more I learn about, you know, different types of medicine, the more I do see that, you know, they are businesses and they're structured because they want recurring revenues. And so, you know, I think it was my dermatologist once to me at a time, and he said to me, Brian, he's like, dermatology is the greatest field because your patients come back and they don't die.
So that's another thing. And let me actually elaborate on that.
Okay.
A lot of people will say, well, hang on, a real problem for Sense going forward when you do get these proof of concept results in the lab, and when it does get onto the radar of the pharma industry, is they're not going to be interested because they make their profits out of people who are sick. And you want to stop people from getting sick. You want to invent preventative geriatrics, so to speak.
Right.
Now, that is true, and potentially it's a big problem, but not necessarily a big problem. If we look at the big blockbuster drugs that are existing today, then some of them are preventative medicine, statins or ACE inhibitors for high cholesterol or for high blood pressure, respectively. Now, what happens there? What's going on? How come? Why are they such big sellers? The answer is because there's a market, because the general public wants to buy them. And that feeds through, obviously, through the providers, through the insurers, the reimbursement situation.
Right.
Now,
and you take them the rest of your life. That helps too.
Well, precisely.
Right.
Now, the question then is, how did it get that way? And essentially, it was through the back door. Statins, for example, for sure, they were not originally developed as a preventative medicine. They were developed to treat actual diagnosed atherosclerosis, and they just kind of crept their way into the preventative world. Now, have I? Okay. Now, the thing is, you know, we must ask, how can this be repeated? And it's not actually clear how, but it's got to be repeated. We've got to get people more comfortable with submitting to medical treatments when they're not yet sick. And once that happens, we're done. The pharma industry, the medical industry in general, they are not the problem because they will follow the money. Public opinion is the problem. Once the public are willing to pay for this, game over.
That's a powerful statement. You know, I have a technology show and we talk about the innovator's dilemma all the time. And it's not like these organizations don't want that next new hot product. It's not like Microsoft wants to be this soon to be old behemoth. It's not the hot new technology. It's just that once you get an organization that's rewarded in a certain way, it's just really hard to turn this ship. And you see that in the United States with the marijuana legalization and all that. It's just, it really takes a long time, especially when you start using language like drugs. You have the kind of the hangover from the late 60s and what psychedelics meant as far as revolutionary, and it really moves slow. And again, the pharmaceutical industry is built for, recurring medicines that make money throughout your life. And if it means that those are going to be opiates you take regularly, as opposed to developing some maybe psychedelic that you take once, you can just see it's not like an evil thing necessarily. And it just that there's no spark there to get it going. And so, yeah, I can see what you mean as far as it taking some time. I always like to find out about some of the habits of some of our guests and how they get where you get. And one of yours is fascinating, and I really want to talk to people about it. I asked for your mobile number when you were coming over, and, well, tell me what you said.
I'm quite sure I told you I don't have a cell phone. Cell phones are the abomination of the century, no question.
Amen.
They, for busy people, for any busy professional, there's only a limited amount of solitude that one has in one's life, and that solitude has to really pay. I want that solitude to be efficient in rejuvenating me, in recharging me, and the way that I can do that is by making it reliable solitude, where I'm not going to get interrupted. So I do not want to have my cell phone ringing. Now, of course, the obvious riposte is, well, hang on, you can turn it off. But then there's a different problem, which is that if you turn it off, then someone tries to call you, they get your voicemail. Now, one of the most insufferable aspects of my personal life right now is that occasionally people, often journalists I have to say, though you have not been guilty of this, will insist that I talk to them on the phone. And they will give me their number and they will say, please ring me when you can. And I will call them and I will get their fucking voicemail. And I do not want to subject other people to that kind of thing. It's these kind of arguments. It's just a repulsive way to communicate. Plus also, quite often people ask me difficult questions that I haven't heard before, and I would like to be able to spend 10 minutes thinking about the answer. And if they ask a question by email, then a delay of 10 minutes is not a problem, whereas it's somewhat discourteous if they're on the phone.
Right. I think there's this concept of information diet that I first heard about 10 years ago with Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Workweek. And I used to follow it. I would only check my email once, and that was at noon every day for 30 minutes. And then I wouldn't allow it to constantly make.
So I'm the other way around. I check my email all the time. Right. And that's really why I get away with not having a cell phone, because I'm so well behaved with my email.
Right. But you train people to go to email because you have no phone and no Facebook.
Essentially. And to me, it minimizes stress. It allows me to be absolutely as granulated as I like to be in terms of how long I take to answer things, how I prioritize things. It works really well for me.
I'm reading this book called Hooked right now, which really looks at a lot of our human characteristics and, how the dopamine works in our brain and how we can get hooked on things like the Facebook notification and how people design products to bring us back and to really hook us into it. And one of them is called variable reward. And the fact that if you go to the Twitter, sometimes you get no news, sometimes you get bad news, sometimes you get great news. And so that keeps us kind of hooked on it. And it even said that email is the original, one of those, because you go and it might be important, it might not be important. You have a social aspect where you want to get back to people, and it's fascinating to see how all of these things really affect us as humans and go back to the tribe mentality and the pack mentality. And so it's important to know and to try to control them, I think, as opposed to them controlling you.
Yep.
So I definitely applaud kind of what you're doing there. I always ask people on this show a few questions, and I don't want to ask you because I think you have some fascinating answers. But Aubrey, if you could make a phone call to the 20-year-old you, pre-doctor, before you got your PhD, and give that young man a bit of advice, what would you tell him?
This is actually a question that I thought about a little bit, because I honestly don't have a good answer. One thing that I can say, looking back at the last certainly the last 30 years of my life, being 51 now, and I would say even beyond that, is that for sure I got where I am today by benefiting from a lot of luck and from a lot of the right advice and so on, but I can't honestly say that I've made all that many mistakes. One thing that I guess most people would point to that seems like an obvious thing I would say is, hang on, don't go into artificial intelligence, go into gerontology. But actually I wouldn't say that. I think that when I did go into gerontology in my late 20s, I benefited a lot from having learnt the tools, the thinking and the mindset and the general way of going about research in a completely different field. This is by no means unique to me. The whole of molecular biology, for example, started that way. It was created by a bunch of physicists who decided they'd like to work on biology in the 50s. I certainly had a few ideas that were very well received in my first few years before I started being a troublemaker in the late 90s, in my first few years in gerontology, that really came to me because I was looking at paradoxical data in a new way. And I was doing that because I was not encumbered by the conventional wisdom of the field. I'd come in from a completely different field. I'd learned enough to understand what the real paradoxes were, but not enough to be trammeled by that.
So it can be good having that real fresh perspective.
It was definitely good. It's happened many times in the history of science and probably in other fields as well.
Right. I mean, we heard that term polymath. It's when people have all of these cross-pollination of different ideas, and they do bring a lot of sometimes groundbreaking ideas to the table, right? Mm-hmm. And so you wouldn't tell yourself to get into gerontology earlier because you like the way you did it.
That's right. Okay. And if I look back, I can't really think of any big mistakes I would have made, things that I would have, that me from the future would have said, don't do that.
Right. You said something to me on one of our email correspondences, and you said something I never heard before, that you said you shouldn't be preoccupied with the criticism you get from people, but you said you should be aware of what they're not telling you. Am I summarizing that correctly?
That was actually a quote from my godfather, who said that to me when I was, I don't know, probably about 8. He said, pay attention to what people are not saying more than what they are saying, because those tend to be the most important things. And I think that's more a piece of advice that applies to one's personal and social interactions rather than one's professional work. But it probably applies pretty generally.
Yeah, and how do you do that? You just try to...
Well, obviously, it's what everyone does, really. It's just a question of how much you concentrate on doing it, just looking at how people's body language rather than their words, if you like. Yeah,
I had a former guest here who's an elementary school teacher, and he says, what does he say? He said, Brian, behavior is communication. So that always says a lot about how people are telling you feedback. What is the best advice you've ever received, whether it be at business or personal or even in the scientific community?
Well, that last one that you just mentioned, paying attention to what people are not saying, but people are kind of communicating without words, that certainly is way up there. Apart from that, I think the other advice that what I've learned over the years has not so much been advice per se, it's been just learning how to do the obvious better. So learning how to delegate better, learning how to speak better, to communicate better, and these things have come incrementally as a result of practice rather than any particular, definable items of advice.
We were talking earlier about how a lot of people in the scientific fields don't necessarily do a lot of speaking, and unfortunately, sometimes it's those people that really need to get their message out. You could even argue that people are attracted to those fields, and probably me one of them, because of their natural introversion. Sometimes you go because the numbers are the numbers, and you don't have to deal with the people sometimes. So do you have advice to some people that might be in the scientific community that are petrified of doing a TED Talk or petrified of going out into the media, except for, I think what you said earlier, twice in their career? What do you tell those people?
I think it depends a lot on their goals. So I don't really think of myself as a typical scientist, not just because I'm much more in the public eye than most scientists, but because I'm deliberately in the public eye. And the reason I'm deliberately in the public eye is because my goals are humanitarian. My goals are really centered on the human benefit, the benefit in terms of quality of life that will result from the work I do. Most scientists aren't like that. Most scientists are actually, there's a phrase, curiosity-driven. They're interested in finding things out for the sake of finding things out. And yeah, it's great if the things they find out end up being of some kind of humanitarian benefit, some kind of technological benefit, but that's kind of not their problem. Whereas it very much is my problem. I mean, I'm all about finding things out to the extent that we need to, but mainly using what we have already found out, not just what I've found out, but what people in general have found out, to actually build ways to manipulate nature.
You wrote me one other thing, I'm going to quote it back to you. You said, when being heretical, seek ways to sidestep the vested interests of those in authority. What does that mean?
There are many ways in which it's hard to be a heretic. And some of those ways are good. A lot of heretics deserve to be because they are wrong. You know, they haven't thought through their heresy very well.
Right, it doesn't have a good connotation, that word, does it?
I guess. I prefer to be a heretic than a maverick. At least it makes it sound as though you might be right. But the thing is, it's a very well-known fact and kind of an inevitable characteristic of human nature and human interaction that those with authority, those in an opinion-forming position, those with influence, tend to be people who've been around a while, and they tend to be fairly protective of that privilege. So I think it was more than 100 years ago now that Max Planck, the famous physicist, said that science advances funeral, by which of course he meant that it takes people to get out of the way by retiring or whatever before the new ideas of the young generation can actually come to the fore. And this is rather a bad thing. You would think that science wouldn't be like that. Idealistically, you would think that new ideas are what science is all about. But it turns out not to work quite that way. And certainly I've had my share of being on the wrong side of that argument, of the overly defensive and perhaps overly aggressive defense of old ideas that deserve to be retired by senior scientists who were responsible for those ideas and would like to see them retain their prominence.
Interesting point. Last part of this question is to the 20-year-old that's listening out there that wants to maybe one day, go into and be a gerontologist, or wants to, pick up the torch or help you along the way. What should they do? What can they do? Great question.
So, I mean, I don't think I can even begin to tell someone an algorithm for following the path that I've taken, because luck has played such a huge role in allowing me to be as influential as I am and to have this role as the kind of global spearhead of this mission. But if one wants to help in general, then it's a little easier. If one's already a scientist, especially if one's already going into biology, then one can make choices that are worse or better with regard to what areas to go into. And that depends on what stage one is at. At an undergraduate level, I always recommend that people should not specialize too much, that they should do general biology degrees that give them a good grounding in everything: genetics, physiology, biochemistry, cell biology, the lot. Because the thing is, aging affects the organism at every level of organization. And one needs to understand all those things in order to have a good sense of proportion, a good intuition about aging. At the PhD and postdoc and so on levels, where one necessarily does specialize, then of course it's all about picking a field that is in need of extra help. It's that's under-recognized for its relative to its actual importance in the grand scheme of things. So there, I say, engage with us in depth. Write to us, tell us what your interests are. Read our publications carefully, and so on.
What's next for you in the next 5 years?
I don't tend to think in terms of time frames. I tend to think in terms of what's next per se. And the reason I do that is because the time frames are so unpredictable. I could get a check for $500 million tomorrow. it's been so stochastic, so up and down, what happens. At the end of the day, I'm constantly updating my priorities on the basis of new information, new opportunities. Of course, most of the new opportunities are not getting large checks, because that happens relatively rarely. What happens much more often is progress in the lab, whether the actual research center that we have in Mountain View, California, or the various labs that we fund extramurally in universities around the world, like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Cambridge and so on. We are interested in all of those things, and I, as the Chief Science Officer, which is of course what I'm trained to do rather than all this media outreach, I'm responsible for reacting to those advances and also, of course, encouraging them and making sure that the people who are making the best progress are given the opportunity to do more.
How long are you going to live?
People often ask me how long I'm going to live, and I have to give a complicated answer, I'm afraid, because of course I don't know.
I would expect nothing less.
It all depends on how soon these advances come. So the answer is what a mathematician would call bimodal. In other words, I think that there's a respectable chance that I'll only live a 2-digit lifespan, less than 100 years, because the therapies won't come along. And there's a respectable chance that I'll live a 4 or 5-digit lifespan, because these therapies do come along for me and I maintain the very, very low risk of death that a young adult has, however long ago I was born. What's relatively unlikely is that I will live only a 3-digit lifespan, because I'll be in some kind of on the cusp. That cusp humanity will transition through that cusp very quickly, and so only a few people will be on the bubble.
Is it fascinating to know that it's actually your own efforts that might control that bimodality, and that the harder you work and the luckier you get could, make a step function in the potential mean of your life?
I would say I have mixed feelings about my position. On the one hand, I regard it as an enormous privilege. There are very few people in the world who can say that they've risen to the real pinnacle of their chosen field of endeavor and are able to spend their life doing exactly what they would have wished to do. So, enormous privilege. On the other hand, it's a huge responsibility, of course. I've got the weight of an awful lot of people's lives on my shoulders. I kind of don't let that get to me, but at the same time, I do work extremely hard. And of course, I am, to some extent, shortening my own life by the fact that I don't get enough sleep, things like that. I figure, even if I just look at my own chances, I'm probably hastening the defeat of aging by a larger amount than the amount that I'm shortening my own life, so it's a net win. But of course, that's not the point for me. The point is that I'm saving a lot of lives.
Right.
So yeah, I guess, it's 6 of 1.
What is the best way for people to get a hold of you to actually go in and read the research and the deep amount? Is it simple just to send them to the website? What's the best way?
You should totally go to the website, sense.org, S for sugar, ENS for sugar.org.
What does that acronym stand for?
Strategy for Engineered Negligible Senescence. I apologize for that. The reason it's so complicated is just because when I was starting out, I wanted to link this new concept to existing concepts within the biology of aging. The term negligible senescence was already an established term which refers to the natural occurrence of species which do not detectably age. And so I wanted to talk about how we could turn a species that obviously does very detectably age, namely the human species, into one that doesn't. And that's where the engineering comes in.
Aubrey, thank you so much for coming. I think this is almost something that, in 50 years or 20 years, will just look as kind of like an anachronism of a conscious shifting that didn't happen. Because, when I look at your stuff, on one hand, it seems so obvious. And then at the same point for you, you're like, yes, this seems obvious. And this is the most important work. And so I think sometimes it's the people that stated the obvious that we hold up in such high regard. Not comparing you with the Einsteins and the Aristotles of the world, but, it's sometimes it is kind of those people that just stand up and say, maybe we should be thinking about this. So I hope when people watch this back in so many years' time, they'll have that same realization. So, well,
I hope they have it at once, because then they might actually be able to make it happen.
Right, and I agree. And like you said, you never know when that check or that movement is going to come along. So so that's fantastic. Please go watch the rest of your lectures for more of the specifics. And he really goes into exactly what he's talking about as far as that kind of gerontology, geriatrics, which I think is an important distinction to make. If you're listening to us on iTunes, you can come see our fantastic faces, and the epic beard of Dr. de Grey. Is there a story behind the beard?
Yes, there is a story behind it. I didn't have a beard at all until I was, let me get this right now, 32. My wife and I got together when I was 26, and she's a real beard fanatic, and she campaigned for 5 years for me to grow one, and I was resistant for a long time. I thought, well, it's not going to be comfortable, it's going to be too hot or whatever, but eventually I decided to give it a go, and I was as surprised as anybody when it came out like this. It grew from nothing to this long in 2 years flat, and since then I don't trim it. It's like eyebrows. There's some kind of genetically imposed equilibrium that, and it's low maintenance, you know, so I don't mind it at all, and other people seem to like it too. And
it's perfect. It's a great brand, and it's you. So fantastic. Thanks for answering that. I'm sure a lot of the hipsters around the shortage are very jealous of that beard. So there you go. As we say on London Real, it's about the journey. I wish you well in yours, and thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
All right, take care.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.
This week on London Real, we have Peter Joseph, founder of the Zeitgeist movement.
The game of capitalism is explicitly based on advantage, and any game of advantage is going to create imbalance. Things have changed, and things evolve, and sometimes evolution isn't pretty. There's so much foul play in this system, there's so much structural rigging in this system, that if people really knew what was happening, there would be an uprising overnight.
But the banking system didn't fail, and I'm not convinced it's going to.
Leaderless concept means that, yes, you go first, and you try to get people to step up and do what they can and initiate new projects, but don't sit there and assume that someone's going to tell you what to do at any point. You have to learn that for yourself. The Venus Project needs to be the Venus Project. Frankly, the split was natural. That's the beauty of the human condition. It's just amazing what we're capable of doing. And by 2050, we're going to have water shortages, food shortages, energy shortages. Well, we have all these people thinking and competing. We get the best, so to speak. No, we don't.
On Sunday, London Real presents Peter Joseph, the Zeitgeist movement.
The beauty of art is it sneaks behind your ego.